You're listening to episode 145 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Dr. Carter Lebares joins us to speak about efficacy of mindfulness-based cognitive training in surgery. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this is made available from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations to keep this podcast going. And if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. As secular mindfulness finds more traction in the world, it's also meeting new perspectives on what practice could be. While traditional forms remain of value to those seeking outcomes that are rooted in a religious context, mindfulness is also being studied under the lens of science. Dr. Carter Lebares is a gastrointestinal surgeon at UCSF Medical Center. She received her medical degree from the University of Minnesota and completed her surgical residency at UCSF. She is also a member of the American College of Surgeons. Carter is director of the UCSF Center for Mindfulness in Surgery, has 20 years of personal practice in mindfulness meditation and self-directed learning regarding stress, cognition, and resilience. She has taken mindfulness teacher training for physicians through the University of Rochester and is a graduate of the Teacher Scholars Program and Medical Education at UCSF. Special thanks to Susan Koo for coordinating today's interview. Our guest today is Carter Lebares. Carter, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
I read the note about your study. I knew immediately that I really wanted to speak with you about a number of different topics, but we'll get to that. Let's start with just having you tell us a bit about your background.
Okay. I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I bring that up because I lived as a youth in a neighborhood in Minneapolis that ended up inspiring me to do all of this work later in life. This was the Powderhorn neighborhood. And for those of you who are familiar with Minneapolis in the 80s, it was a really diverse, social justice-oriented neighborhood with a lot of economic challenges, but also a tremendous amount of promise and very much a sense of people having a civic duty to their community and to the world at large. So that was really absorbed into me from a pretty young age. And as I grew up, I watched the young people that were my friends and neighbors and playmates. Many of them have tremendously different trajectories than I had. And so at a pretty early age, I started noticing this difference in what people were able to and allowed to do themselves in their life. And as I got older, this interest became a little bit more focused, and I found myself drawn to science and drawn to eventually medicine. And in that process, I started to learn about resilience and resilient science. And at that point in time, which would have been, I guess, the mid to late 90s, there were almost no studies linking resilience and mindfulness. Those two worlds were parallel, absolutely, but quite distinct. And it wasn't until I started medical school at the University of Minnesota that I was first introduced to mindfulness and MBSR and John Kabat-Zinn. Thankfully, there's an academically affiliated center at the University of Minnesota that's very much invested in complementary and alternative medicine. And it was through them that I made this acquaintance. And that was when I realized that this idea of resilience, this thing that I was hoping to figure out how to teach young people, might take the form of teaching mindfulness. So that was what I set about to do. And when I entered medical school, I planned to become some kind of doctor that could facilitate this work, like a adolescent health care provider or a primary care provider. And that persisted until I opened my first abdomen in a surgery as an advanced student. And it just blew my mind. And I knew that I needed to be around that kind of thing for the rest of my life, if possible. And so I went into surgery, not really knowing how it would relate to this other passion of mine, but just sort of trusting that somehow it would become clear. And after many, many years of training, I found myself at UCSF and sitting down with the chair of surgery, talking about a future academic appointment and becoming faculty. And she is a marvelous woman who asked me what I thought my research interest would be. And I told her the truth, which was I'm interested in resilience and training resilience through mindfulness meditation and doing it for people who are full of potential, but highly stressed. And she said, well, we don't have any economically stressed adolescents around here, but we have a bunch of surgeons and they need this as bad as anyone. So why don't you start with them? And that was really the genesis.
Oh, that's an amazing story. And we'll talk a little bit more maybe after the podcast about Minneapolis, because that's we have some shared interest there as well. So I'm very interested in, it sounds like when you mentioned the area that you wanted to go into, that there wasn't an immediate rejection of that often within the medical profession saying, I'm interested in this particular area for quite some time. Others have reported that they were discouraged from getting into that, either as a therapist or in the medical profession or other areas. But it sounds like there was some encouragement, at least within the domain of healthcare itself, and the surgeons in particular were having difficulties with this. What was it like for you to get that? Yeah, there's a need for this here. How did that then play out?
Well, it was interesting because so much of our culture is based on outcomes, not process. Mm-hmm. And I think we are coming to learn, especially as in medicine, as we embrace palliative care and hospice, and this idea that perhaps it's not the goal to just prolong life, but to rather ensure that lives are spent richly and well, or to encourage health rather than just longevity. I think we're beginning to see that the process really matters. But honestly, I was constrained by that same way of thinking when this first came up, because my first thought was, how will surgeons ever be open to the idea that there's a whole new avenue of skills and training that they quote unquote need when they are already so high performing and so excellent? And this was really a conundrum for me. I really trusted my mentor that she knew what she was talking about. She was quite a veteran, had been doing her job for 20 years at the time that our conversation happened. But it was really when I found myself having a conversation about this work with one of the real historical lions of our department, who was a good 20 years older than my mentor, and one of the surgeons that really paved the way for modern surgery today, who happened to be deeply interested in this subject of perception and resilience and personal experience. And I don't know, after one or two conversations, and when I felt like I could trust him for an honest answer, I said, I have to ask you, why would any of you or us want to do this? And you case in point, like, why are you interested in this when you've done it all? You're internationally respected, you've written textbooks, you've pioneered entire new avenues in surgery that have been profession and life-changing for countless people. Like, who cares? And it was pretty astounding. He said, but imagine if I had known balance or happiness or joy or myself during that process. What more could I have done? What more could I have passed on to someone else for them to build on? And it made me realize that there were regrets as well as an awareness of a loss of something that was present even in these people who on the outside were flawless. And so that conversation was probably almost equally as important as the encouragement I got initially from my mentor and chairwoman.
Yeah. And it sounds like that connected with, as you have been describing your background, about
yes,
that there was this need to help others.
Yeah.
It was not just an individual experience of navel gazing and I could have been more. It's also, how does this affect the rest of the world? And that really
Yes.
synced up with how your life had gone.
Yeah, it's really true. I think it's interesting how we sort of categorize suffering, that, my suffering's more than yours or mine's worse than yours. And it's been a funny, subtle education that it is important to acknowledge differences, that I can't necessarily understand your unique suffering, but we all share the experience of suffering in one way or another. And that's absolutely not depressing at all. That's actually really wonderful. It's this strange universal experience that binds us.
Yeah. So let's shift a little bit to the Center for Mindfulness in Surgery and how that really got started, because now that's an established thing. How did that start?
Yeah. Well, so after I had that conversation with my chairwoman, a little more time elapsed, I think a couple years, where I sort of thought about what this would look like. I finished my training. I finished my fellowship training. And I came back from my fellowship training to UCSF and was essentially given the charge to conduct the first study. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't know anything about conducting a clinical trial, but I knew a lot about good science. And I certainly knew a tremendous amount about the literature around contemplation, mindfulness studies, designing mindfulness studies, etc. And so really, we launched this ridiculously comprehensive randomized controlled trial of a small group of surgery interns, doing everything from psychological self-report assays all the way up to telomeres and hair cortisol levels and functional brain scans. And it was quite a crazy experience. Besides my chairwoman, I think at that period of time, every other surgeon, clinician, administrator, or leader that I spoke to, almost down to a man, thought it was ridiculous. And the funny thing is that many of them said, I think this idea is ridiculous, but I trust you, or I like you, or I believe in you, so I'll help you, even though I think what you're going to end up with is a big handful of ridiculous. So that was how it went.
And how did that go for them after having gone through these processes?
Yeah, well, it's actually really interesting because I love surgeons. I love the way surgeons think and approach things. of course, there's variety among us, but one thing I found to be true is that if you put in the effort to build evidence and not hand wave, not exaggerate, not embellish, but just to tell the truth and to tell it as cleanly and completely as you possibly can, they will weigh it for themselves, and they are absolutely willing to do a 180 and correct their ways based on what you find. And so that was actually one of my biggest champions now, is a person who at the beginning said, this is completely cockamamie, but I will let you do it simply because I can't stand to hear you ask me one more time.
Persistence.
Yeah, yep. So persistence. But now, interestingly, just a year ago, we started offering classes for faculty. And even though people initially were very begrudging about allowing their residents to attend the trainings, it's now become something where more and more senior levels are asking for training. And we've actually adapted it for faculty. And I think somewhere around 70 or 80 surgery and anesthesia faculty have now done the same training. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting, we're at kind of an inflection point here in terms of like a cultural change.
I think it's one of the challenges that mindfulness teachers often have is resistance from MDs when it comes to mindfulness.
Yeah.
And your way of working with that, and I really appreciate how you're characterizing good science, is that, of course, it's tentative. And as we get new information, we change our minds to reflect what the data shows. It's not about embellishing or pulling a fast one on it. It's showing, well, what do we see? What actually happens in practice? And how do we measure that? It's not all just self-report. It's also biometric measures and the rest of it.
Yes, it is.
I thank you so much for doing good science. I'm very curious to hear more about your thoughts on active controls for mindfulness studies, because that's, of course, one of the difficulties we have is not just wait list, but also how do we have active controls around this? Maybe we can talk a little bit about the study that we're here to chat about, which is the efficacy of mindfulness-based cognitive training in surgery. So tell us a little bit about this study itself. What did you do? How did this get started?
So this was the first pilot study that I did back in 2016. And since then, we've done 2 additional waves, actually 3, but the 4th wave is varied to an extent. But in this first pilot study, we sent out an invitation to the entire incoming class of surgery interns at UCSF and invited all of them to participate in this 8-week-long training that was 2 hours per week with 20 minutes of recommended homework. That was our population, our target population. We had about 50% of those interns enroll.
Wow.
And these were interns that were all doing an initial year of training in general surgery, but who were slated to launch into neurosurgery, ear, nose, and throat, urology, plastics, oromax face, all different kinds of subspecialties. So it was quite an eclectic mix, but all surgeons at heart. And the active control that we used for the randomized controlled trial portion was specifically constructed with myself and another faculty member at UCSF who's a surgeon and a surgical educator. And this particular gentleman's interest is in kind of the history of surgery, but even more than that, kind of the ethos of surgery. And what does it take, not on a technical or physical endurance standpoint, but rather a personality and psychology standpoint to be a successful surgeon. And so he had spent quite a bit of time thinking about this already and was actually really intrigued by the idea of formalizing a curriculum around these concepts. So what I wanted was something that provided the same amount of protected time. So that's time where you don't have to answer your pager and you don't have to work. Time with peers in a special setting that was bonding. And then time where the participants got to interact with a faculty member in a unique way that built a unique relationship. And then finally, content that was relevant and meaningful to their training. So part of this was stemmed from a contract with the program to not waste these people's time, because every hour is so precious in training like this. And then part of it also was my desire, just as a scientist, to have a really stringent, powerful control. So this curriculum he called The Mind of a Surgeon, and it involved 8 articles taken mostly from the lay press about aspects of surgical or medical experience. And so that could be things like dealing with a patient who you don't like, or how do you maintain your own physical health or sense of self, even as you give yourself over to this consuming experience and profession of becoming a surgeon. Some of the other things had to do with death and dying. When do you choose not to operate? Things like that. And each week, as a group, they would read these articles out loud together and then spend usually the second half or 45 minutes of the class discussing them. And in every way, this paralleled the mindfulness training class, except there was no discussion of mindfulness and no experiential practice in mindfulness. And I have found that meticulous emphasis on such a stringent active control has been critical in people coming to believe that our findings are valid.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a science communicator, it's often, I will speak with people who they either want to be on the podcast because they think they have something to share based on experience that is not actually credentials, that is not evidence-based. And I've had to turn down quite a number of folks. I'm not seeing anything that's peer-reviewed here. And it's not to say we don't have here, we do. But seeing good science is a different caliber. In that it helps to validate, well, what are we seeing? We know from our experience this is happening, but how do we actually know that that experience itself is valid in the world, that we can point to and replicate and share amongst others? So it's not just my internal experience, but it's something you can see, measure, and repeat.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm dying to know, what were the results? What did you see? And what were the different aspects of being a surgeon, the mind of a surgeon that you measured, and what were the results?
Well, so it's interesting. All of the participants got assayed at baseline, so before they ever attended a day of surgery residency. Then after the intervention itself, which was roughly 12 weeks later, so they had both experienced surgery residency and then either taken our intervention or taken the Mind of a Surgeon course. And then we left them alone completely for a year and then assayed them again at a time point in the spring, right before they moved on to their second year of training. So at each of those time points, we took multiple sets of data. They did a survey that was comprised of several validated questionnaires asking about everything from stress to burnout to depression to mindful tendencies, like innate mindful tendencies. We did blood draws, taking samples for telomere and epigenetic gene panel analysis, as well as some simple circulating markers like C-reactive protein. We took hair samples to look at hair cortisol levels. And then even in that initial study, we collected 12-hour urine samples to look at catecholamines. And I can tell you some really funny stories about that. Very, very humbling. And you would not believe how many high-performing young surgeons don't know how to screw the lid on a urine container. It's kind of amazing. Anyway, so we also did motor skills testing using some simulation trainers that have modules that are developed by one of our national minimally invasive surgery governing bodies. And then we did functional brain scans. And throughout all of these measures, we weren't sure if we would see any effect at all. And the reason I was so comprehensive wasn't just to be, a hoarder of data, but really because no one had ever asked, we knew mindfulness was potent, and we knew that if done correctly, which is its own important point, but when done correctly, that it can have profound effects on other high stress populations. But no one had ever tested that in surgeons. And how are we to say that the stress of being incarcerated or pre-military deployment is the same in magnitude or caliber as that of being a surgeon? We just don't know, right? And I don't think we'll ever know. That stress is a matter of personal perception. So who can say? In any event, I wasn't sure if we saw any benefit, where we would see it. And what was fascinating was that we saw benefit, granted, in a small pilot study that was not powered to show statistical effects, but was powered to show effect size, which is sort of like the degree of promise that an intervention has to potentially have a statistically significant impact if you were to get a big enough study in the future. So this is what we geared ourselves towards. One, just to show that it was even feasible to teach surgeons mindfulness. Would they hate it? Would they stomp out of the room? Would everyone lie and force these guys to bring their live pagers into the meditation space, which would just be blown up with electronic beeping, or what? So unequivocally, hands down, we showed that it's feasible, and hands down, it was acceptable. So in terms of actually being beneficial, we saw interesting things. We absolutely saw that mindfulness increased in the intervention group. And, that's rewarding because studies don't often show that. But you do have to ask, perhaps they were just more mindful because they just heard more mindful jargon for 2 months.
Right.
So it's interesting, but limited. But we also saw that the magnitude of stress reported by the intervention participants was much less than that reported by the controls. And a similar thing was happening with depressive symptoms. Interestingly, we saw no difference in burnout. And that was bothersome because it was not expected. But partly I wondered if it was because our study was so small, we weren't really able to look at the different subcomponents of burnout. We could only look at burnout as a whole. Fast forward, I can tell you that we just have analyzed all 3 years of our data and have now shown that there are statistically significant differences in emotional exhaustion in those that receive the intervention, but not in depersonalization, interestingly. And the glimmers of big effect sizes or interesting magnitude differences between the two groups have borne out with statistically significant results now that we have a bigger group of people to study. The other interesting thing that we saw had to do with executive function. So the parts of the mind or brain that allow us to make complicated decisions, to do complicated procedures, to be creative, or to have multifaceted problem solving. We had several measures of these executive function abilities. And in one measure, working memory capacity, we saw a profound increase in the intervention group over the course of a year. So it wasn't that marked right after the intervention, but as 12 months passed, it seemed to grow. And of course, that's exciting. And, I wrote lots of grand fiction in my mind about why that was. But honestly, we don't quite know, but it's intriguing. But almost more striking was that for a different measure of executive function called cognitive control, we saw that the control group actually had a decrement. And this makes sense. I mean, there are many, many studies that have shown that unmitigated chronic stress takes a toll on cognition. We know this. And why it wouldn't take a toll on surgeons, there is no reason. So it's not at all surprising that it would, but it was so provocative to us because I honestly never looked at this in terms of preventing decline. I really looked at it in terms of improving performance. Mm-hmm. And yet we were beginning to see these signs that this was actually accomplishing both. There were similar changes in motor skills, although those are much harder to interpret. Motor skill, complex, precise motor skills are actually a whole field of study in themselves. And that data we are continuing to downplay because I want to make sure we understand it really well before I say anything about it. But then the brain scans were equally fascinating, because what we had expected to see was that those people in the intervention, when shown emotionally disturbing images and then asked to decrease their emotional response to those images, we presumed that they would recruit this very intellect-based circuit in the brain called reappraisal. And we assumed that based on other literature that's shown that reappraisal is this sort of natural and healthy mechanism for helping people cope with disturbing events. And essentially, it's kind of related to resilience in the fact that it's a process of looking at something that is negative and finding a way to recast it as being positive. And that's really kind of what resilience is at its heart, right? Like, you experience something stressful, and instead of seeing it as an overwhelming threat, you reframe it as a challenge. And so, coming from a background of resilience and an interest in resilience, I just sort of assumed that would be the mechanism. But what was really interesting was that the control and the intervention both showed activation in their reappraisal networks in seemingly equivalent amounts when they had to reframe their reaction to these negatively evocative images. So there was no difference there. Where we did see a difference was only in the intervention group and only post-intervention. We saw that these two unique areas of their brain were particularly lit up. And again, our current data set, we are looking at this in a much finer, more sophisticated way, simply because fMRIs are so exciting and pretty and bright lights, shiny, sparkly things that we all want to attribute fMRI findings with tremendous meaning. But we're trying to be very conservative, So I can only say what we saw was increased activation. So increased metabolic activation in two areas of the brain that we didn't expect to see. One was the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the other was the precuneus or posterior cingulate cortex. And this was jaw-dropping for me, because it may not mean anything, but it's striking that those two areas have pretty well-defined, unique attributions. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is considered the executive control hub of the brain. So, if you will, the master switch. And it is presumably the part of the brain that sort of oversees in a top-down fashion all of the other functionality of your executive processing capabilities. The precuneus is considered, it's a much less well-characterized part of the brain, but we believe that when different parts of the brain connect to the precuneus, it's in relation to one's sense of self. And so sense of self, self-awareness, which includes internal and proprioceptive awareness, we think, and self-agency. So a sense of being able to do something about whatever it is that's at hand, whatever it is one is experiencing. So without trying to imply too much or assume something that's not there, suffice to say, it is simply remarkable that when faced with distressing emotional imagery, that people who've had this training invoke preferentially parts of their brain that are responsible for our most complex, adaptive, and creative thinking, and our most self-aware and self-responsible, I guess you might say, sense of being. So those might be the results that I'm more excited about than any, really.
And what I find very fascinating about this is throughout, you've been very positive about the control intervention, which was not a wasted time. This was not you're going to sit and do shopping lists. This was
No.
a very active, real control that had benefits of its own. So I'm kind of interested in hearing that. My expectation is there were pre and post differences that both interventions showed, your control and your mindfulness group, because of the strength that's inherent with that control group on its own, that there was benefit to the surgeons in that. Is that so? Is that something that they were getting benefit out of?
Well, it's interesting. They didn't get benefit in the same ways that the intervention did. And yet they loved the class. And they said that they really, from a subjective standpoint, the participants, every year that we've done it now, actually, because every year that we've repeated the study, we've used the same active control. They said that it was really a wonderful experience for them to, number one, have a group of peers that they could come and just check in with about this unbelievable experience that they were having, sometimes unbelievably marvelous and sometimes unbelievably horrible. And then also to be reminded by a respected senior faculty member that things like disliking your patient or feeling like a fool or having arrogance that's replaced with, humility are actually a natural part of this evolution. And it made those pretty tumultuous experiences seem much more manageable. So they didn't get quite the benefits that we hoped for, which I guess is good from a research standpoint, but they did get benefit from it. So I actually felt good that we didn't waste their time.
So maybe one final question about all of this is why you find this to be important and of value.
I think if you had asked me when I designed the first study, I would have said it's important because we can be better, which is ironic because that's such a striving mentality, right? And yep, it is. But that's the truth. I thought it was, maybe we could be even better. And maybe many of these things that we don't know how to solve, that still plague us as the mysteries and the struggles of medicine and life and death, maybe we can solve them. Maybe we can bring something to bear on them by recruiting this different part of our awareness and being. And I think that's a good motivation. But really, now my motivation has changed. There's something funny about seeing these interns month after month and watching them take deep breaths and learn to walk meditatively, and then seeing them apply these things, because I'm there attending. I mean, I see them in the clinics, I see them in the OR, I see them on the wards, even when we're far away from the land of research study. And I see them applying these things. And then I watched the controls not have these assets. And I watched them suffer much more. And when they would come in and they would get their brain scans and I would tuck them in, with like a blanket or something because it's cold in the scanner room, I started to really see them much more wholly as people and recognize that people come into medicine, into surgery, but I think probably medicine as a whole, with this unbelievable promise. And it's like the promise that I saw in the kids I grew up with, that there is this sense of just almost like pure good, wanting to serve others, just wanting to give whatever gifts they have to their society, to their community. And then I also saw how unbelievably fragile they were, and that they can endure. They can endure and become masterful technicians and incredible intellects. But that part of them, their promise, their hope, their desire to be selfless, that part is fragile. And now I think this is important because I cannot even imagine what people, much less physicians, much less surgeons, might be like if that part of them is nurtured to flourish in the same way as our intellect. Like, it's really inconceivable.
Thank you so much for that. So for folks who are interested in finding out more, I'm going to have some links on the episode page for this episode. And that will include a link to the Center for Mindfulness and Surgery. If you'd like to find out more, please check that out. Our guest today, Carter Lebares. Carter, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, it's an honor. Really, thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.